Hi, good day, and thank you for taking the time to come to one of the last panels and hopefully to wrap out the conversations you've had this week with a different perspective. But we probably have to come clean and be clear that we're here talking about race, gender, and work, but we are going to really focus on this through the lens of women. And as you know, if you've been here for the last several days, women and their health, their financial security, and their participation in work has been at the center of many of the conversations. And whether you look at women through the lens of their labor force participation, pay equity, health participation, financial security, women are challenged to live the lives that are healthy, wealthy, and secure, and to continue to stay in the workforce the way we need them to stay. So we talked as a team, we could talk about lots and lots of different data, but we want to be clear that we really are going to talk about this issue through a lens of kind of intersectionality, and all of the generic data about women has to be broken down to what is the cohort of women you're talking about. My favorite one is pay equity, where I spend a lot of my life. So, you know, many of you know we all use the statistics 76 to 77 cents on the dollar every woman makes for every man. But again, if you look at that through the lens of what do Hispanic women make, 56 cents on the dollar, what do black women make, 64 cents on the dollar, every one of these topics is very complex. And if anything, I don't think we've done a good enough job making sure that we look at this through the lens of who is really having the experience in the labor force, who's really experiencing the health system, and what are we doing to actually ensure that that changes. If you overlay the caregiving world on top of that, we have a whole other set of statistics, right? Because unfortunately, while we value women, supposedly, and we want to pay them equally, we do not value caregivers the way we value other roles. And so when you look at what happens to women, because not only are they the primary caregivers, but if you look at what percentage of women around the world between 45 and 55 leave the workforce to provide caregiving, and you look at what is the present value of that lost income stream from any economic perspective, it's really troubling. So with that, we are going to be optimistic, right? We're going to talk about all of the things that we actually think are going to work to help women, and we have an amazing panel of different perspectives. So we really tried to make sure that we had a public policy, we had an NGO perspective, an employer perspective. But I'm going to start with Debra Whitman. Many of you may have met Debra. I've been at Milken with her for a number of years, but she's the Chief Policy Officer of AARP. And AARP has had a deep-seated passion about the status of older women. And one of the things, Debra, you know, in the recent really kind of mini book you guys all wrote, you talk about taking care of women, older women, through the lens of unfinished business, and what are the things that we really need to do. You're really passionate about it as a team, and so I thought we'd start with your kind of broad perspective on the state of women, and we can move from there.
Thank you. And one of the reasons why AARP is really passionate about women is we were founded by an older woman, Ethel Percy Andrews, 60 years ago. I want to start with talking about inequality, but inequality in time, and specifically on lifespans. Women actually live longer than men, but if you really take that intersectionality perspective, we see that that sort of breaks down. Women at the top 1% live 10 years longer than women who have the bottom 1% of income. That's 10 more years of life. And while women live about 5 years longer than men, and Hispanic women actually live 3 years longer than white women, who live 3 years longer than African American women, that disparity also varies a lot about your income, your education, and where you live. I think one of the most shocking things is how important where you live matters, and that's all of that socioeconomic pieces and the culture of health coming together. In the city of Chicago, people from the north side live 21 years longer than people in the south side. So those differences are really, really huge. So that's inequality in time. Across our life course, there are huge inequalities in income and in wealth. As you mentioned, women earn less per pay period, but they also are more likely to work part-time. They're more likely to leave the labor force not just to take care of their kids, but to their parents and grandparents. And so out of the labor force for about 12 years on average. And all of those things add up, and I think Lisa will talk about the wealth gap, but it also means that your Social Security checks are going to be lower, having those years of lower pay. It also means if you're working part-time, you probably didn't qualify for the 401k. And when we ask women if preparing for your future is more important than other priorities, many women say yes. So all of these things, we live longer, we have less, and there are huge racial disparities and disparities by gender, income, and education. So I think this is a great panel to talk about all those
And it's
things.
difficult to aggregate. I mean, to aggregate some of those insights across that spectrum, I think we find that very challenging. And you know, I'm going to introduce Will Dow. Will is the dean of the University of California, Berkeley School of Public Health. And you know, we were in a session 2 days ago together. And you know, you really really impacted me personally about thinking about women through this lens of vulnerable populations, chronic diseases, and really making sure that we are unpacking this issue through a very specific view of who doesn't get represented in this conversation, who really doesn't get represented in this room. So love to hear you, talk about what you see, but also what we should be doing to make sure that those perspectives and those voices get factored into these kinds of conversations and these kinds of events. So.
No, thank you very much for having me, and thank you as well, Deborah, for sort of teeing up many of these issues. There is a conundrum when we speak about women's health that we look at the life expectancy statistics, and women live, on average, much longer than men. That hasn't always been true. It wasn't true if we go back to the 19th century, so it's nothing sort of innately biological necessarily that's driving that whole difference. This depends very much on the environment and the society in which people are living, and we have many choices in our society how we're arranging those threats. The gap between men and women has actually been declining across the latter part of the 20th century. Women's life expectancy is not growing as fast as men's has been, and partly that's due to the long arm of smoking decisions earlier on in the century. But we're also very concerned that this has to do with the changing nature of women's lives in our society today. And one of the really interesting statistics, the canary in the coal mine, is that if we look at happiness statistics throughout the life course, what we're seeing is that in the past, earlier in the 20th century, women on average were happier than men. And actually that's no longer true. It's sort of flipped. And what people are starting to really try to dig into and understand is how much of this has to do with the caregiving that the sandwich generations have really been experiencing. Women have been increasingly going into the labor force, fulfilling their career aspirations, but at the same time, they are still doing just as much work around the house and caregiving, both for the younger generation and the older generation. And this can create an environment of sort of toxic stress. It's particularly difficult for those women who are single caregivers, who don't have support around them in order to help out around the house, to help them to stay in the labor force. And what we don't have right now is a really robust system to help for women who have caregiving needs in terms of paid leave, and I know that some of our colleagues will be talking about this more, so I'll just tee that up because I'm curious to pursue that conversation.
That's great, that's great. So Sarita, I know you are Sarita Gupta, who's the executive director of Caring Across Generations. We could spend, and I think a number of us would spend the majority of this conversation talking about the role of care and caregiving through every lens, right? So I do the majority of my work with global multinationals, and it's so difficult for me to get CEOs and boards to pay attention to care. They'll pay attention to financial security, they'll pay attention to the workforce for the future, but when we try to get them to think about, you no longer can avoid having a philosophy on care for your employees, for your retirees, it's a challenge. And it's a challenge from two very specific lenses. One is, I don't think they understand the ROI of caring about care. So again, we haven't done a good enough job. But I also think this is the disparity where the experience that some individuals have that are well advantaged financially, their care search, their care experience is so different. So, and it's exacerbated by the fact that women are the primary caregivers. Yeah. So we're not going to solve it, but I'd love you to at least unpack a little. You seem very optimistic when you write about care is coming into its own, both as a social issue, an economic issue, a benefits issue. But let's start the conversation about how do we get it to mean as much as other elements.
Absolutely. It's true that care and caregiving is very undervalued and has been really invisible in our economy. This is a very personal issue for me because I am also, as Will introduced this idea, I'm a sandwich generation family caregiver and I work full time, but I care for a father with Alzheimer's and I have an 8-year-old daughter. And so that squeeze we're talking about is really what too many women in this country are experiencing. So just to give a little, just to unpack it a bit, I mean, we are in the midst of such a massive demographic shift, as we know. We're rapidly aging as a nation, with 10,000 people reaching retirement age every day. And we also have the first wave of millennials having children at 4 million a year. And so that the care needs are just exploding in our country, and yet we have a very outdated system of caregiving right now. We're the second decade into the new millennium, and we have a system that was built at a time when the economy depended on the presumption of women's unpaid work in the home, right? So the impact is huge in terms of women who do, in fact, end up leaving the workforce to care for their loved ones. We know there are statistics out there, many, but women up to $300,000 in wages, Social Security, pension is like left on the table when women leave the workforce. So this is a huge burden, and it's a particular burden for those of us in the sandwich generation. I would just add, in addition to family caregivers who are squeezed, and about 50% of our workforce is going to be aging, caring for an aging adult in the next 5 years. So we need supports in place for family caregivers. We also see that family caregivers can't do this alone, right? We do need a paid workforce, and that has been very invisible in these conversations around care and caregiving. But we have a paid workforce in this country that is not, we don't have enough workers to really meet the demands. And there's a lot of historical reasoning for why that exists, but just to say this is some of the most vulnerable workers in our economy today. Poverty wages, about $13,000 annually is what they make. Over half rely on public assistance. So we have a moment of great demand, and I believe we have a moment to actually invest in a care infrastructure in this country to ensure that we can invest in the workforce that we need, we can create supports for family caregivers, and have more affordable care options for families and individuals. And as we get into the conversation, I am optimistic, because I do believe out of necessity, our country is finally going to have to deal with valuing care and come up with real solutions.
So we'll come back to it, because I think one of the things we're also seeing is a real curiosity about why care as an employee benefit for active workers. You think about the energy it took us to get maternity and paternity to be parental leave. We're getting a lot more energy now around care and leave holistically, so very excited to hear that perspective.
ARP just added that as a benefit for our workers, 2 weeks of care leave. It can be for anyone who needs it of any age.
As did Bank of America Merrill Lynch, and we have seen incredible usage of it.
Usage.
Yep, and employee satisfaction.
So Lisa, if it isn't enough, if we talk about the pay, we talk about the pay and labor force participation issues, we talk about the care issues, but then and I apologize, I didn't introduce you, Lisa Morgeson, she's the Managing Director of Retirement Client Experience at Bank of America Merrill Lynch, and you and I share a lot of passion about how bad the data is about women's financial security. And one of the data points, so whether it was our Healthy, Wealthy, Work-Wise for Women or your research, the data point that always hit me is that 61% of women would rather talk about their own death than financial security and investing. So that's pretty pathetic, right? I mean, so that's scary. And yet when we look at how do men and women feel about all of these issues, whether they look at their preparedness for the workforce of the future, their ability to take care of their health, the biggest gap between men and women at all ages is lack of women's confidence in financial security. And so, given all the work we've done on educating women and the percentage of women in universities, what's the biggest obstacle? Why are women still struggling to think about wealth accumulation and investing the same way they think about care? And I know that sounds, I know it's a very, it's a generic statement, but all the data is actually quite true. So love to hear your view on why are we not making progress here?
Yeah, a couple of things. We actually did, in the last 12 months, we did 4 research studies on life events. And that's important for us to understand the different financial journeys of our clients so that we can talk about it and help them prepare for it early. When it came to women's financial wellness and financial journey, the research we did really shined a light on 4 major impacts that make a woman's financial journey different than a typical man's financial journey. One is what we talked about is women live longer. So longevity, we need to plan for that longevity. Women live longer than men, on average, 5 years longer. They retire 2 years earlier. They spend 36% more time in retirement. That time in retirement, many years alone, they need to be prepared for that. Second is the pay gap. We actually used 82 cents to the dollar. And if you look at that across 2 equal careers, 42 years in the workforce, it ends up accumulating to over $420,000. That's a lot of money. That can secure several years in retirement that just in general, more than $420,000 can support. The third is the wealth gap. When you think about financial security, it's more than just a man's pay income. It's all of the assets that they accumulate. It's their 401k. It's their property. It's their investments, as well as what they do with their income. The difference between the average woman's wealth and man's wealth is what we call the wealth gap, and it's bigger than the pay gap. It's due in part due to women's less opportunity to have what we called wealth escalators. And we talked a little bit about this. You put less into your 401k. Many 401ks these days have an employer match. That means you're getting less of a match. It means your compounding is less. When you retire, if your pay is less, your Social Security potentially could be less, your pension benefits. So that equates, in the study we did, that equates to that in addition to time out of the workforce, which I'll talk about in a second, was well over $1 million. That is significant to anyone. The third is the life stage implication, which we've talked a little bit about. The time out of the workforce, we calculated across these studies, on average, a woman spends 44% of her working adult life out of the workforce. Caregiving is a perfect example of that. Man spends, on average, about 28%. So big difference. We also did a study on widowhood. Women are 3.5 times more likely to become widows in their life. It's not something you plan for, or it's not something you talk about, but it's something you need to plan for. 52% of the recipients in our survey said they had no plan for what happened if someone passed. Women's number one financial challenge after becoming a widow, they told us, was was making financial decisions alone. So we also did a parenting study, which I won't take the time to go into now, but very interesting as well. So different financial journey. The takeaway here is acknowledge it's different, talk about it early, talk about it often. That's the only way we're going to collectively be able to address these differences, acknowledge them, talk about them, and plan for them.
I'm going to introduce Kara James. She's the director of the Office of Minority Health and Centers for Medicare and Medicaid. And one of the things, Kara, I'm hoping you'll talk about is so many of the conversations at Milken focus on people who have the education and the means and the wherewithal to even think about accumulating wealth and to think about financial planning and think about 401k. And yet a lot of your focus and work is really on the economically disadvantaged women and women of color, Hispanic, white women, and certainly the lens that I was really, really interested in is we focus a lot on urban, right? So we focus a lot on what you can do if you live in Washington or DC or LA, but talk a little bit about when you look at this through the lens that you look at it, it's even worse, right? I mean, if it's a problem that seems to me almost sometimes not solvable. So we're not going to go to the not solvable and come out, but I do think that one of the things we're really seeing is just this focus that we have to think about diversity and inclusion through every economic class, not just through the lens of race and ethnicity. So, you just bring us into that space because that's something that I don't feel like we really deal with enough.
Right.
In these conversations.
Yeah, so thank you so much for including me in part of the conversation. And I think really, we do sit at the intersection of a lot of these areas. And so when we're thinking about the topic today, race, gender, work, and the economics, it really starts at birth and almost, sort of when you think about the role that coverage plays, and we see birth outcomes for particularly African American women and the high infant mortality rates, and just even what that means for care, for your support. Really, we talk about, conversations have talked about women and their incomes, but we also need to talk about the social factors and those social determinants. Marriage is a huge factor in support, and minority women, particularly African American women, have significantly lower marriage rates, and never married is so much higher. And so if you're never married, higher rates of divorce, higher rates of widowhood among particularly African American women. That gap impacts your income, impacts your property, impacts what you see in retirement, and also impacts your health outcomes. Because as Sarita's talking about, if you're a single caregiver, in that sandwich gap, you're caring for the children, you're working, you're caring for your supports. It also brings in that question of who's going to care for you. And it's something, I kind of think about as like a single woman who's getting up to that age, and I sort of look at my brothers going, I'm going to be in a cardboard box somewhere, sort of thinking about that. But, what that means for who's going to care for you. And when you add into the income challenges, your choices about aging at home, planning for someone to come in and help take care of you have huge implications. And then when you layer on that rural or geographic isolation, the supports that may be in your community vary. And so it kind of ties into a lot of the health outcomes that we see, and you see that minority individuals end up in nursing homes at a younger age, and that they're sicker kind of going into these, and some of the quality of care outcomes that we have, but also just really a lot of this ties in together. And so you look at education, so educational attainment, minority women, and Black, Hispanic women, American Indian, Alaska women, who we don't really talk that much about because we often don't have the data to really look at some of those issues, their educational attainment is lower. And so what does that mean for the job choices that you have? And as Sarita was talking about some of the caregivers, many of them are immigrants and making low wage, which means has compounding implications for their retirement. So I think it really is a swirling of a lot of these issues that come together. But there are some promising things that we can look at. So there is some challenges that we want to talk about, but I don't want to leave it as we can't do anything about that, because I think that's often what people feel, and there is hope.
And Pat, I'm really glad she brought up not just that women are the caregivers, but 2/3 of the people in nursing home are women.
That's right.
Right? And let's just be clear, nursing homes aren't cheap.
Right.
If you're out of pocket, it's $90,000 a year on average. Medicaid obviously is a great program and a really important program, especially right now as we see it under attack, that helps provide low-income women with the ability to be in a care setting. But I think we need to look at, women are giving the care, and particularly diverse women are giving the care, and I'd like Sarita to talk a little bit more even about that. But they're also receiving the care because they live longer, because they're more likely to be single and widows and all of those things.
Yeah, just to build on that for a moment, because Kara, I was so glad you lifted that up. I mean, majority of the paid care workforce are in fact women of color and immigrants. And the reason for why the wages have been so low and undervalued is very much historical roots around how the association of the work with Black women. Right, and we have a lot to fix in terms of ensuring that they are compensated for the very valuable work that they do. And having said that, what we often deny, and this is a real tension in the care economy conversation, we deny that caregivers, paid caregivers themselves, are also aging themselves and are in fact in need of care. So most paid caregivers don't even have the resources or the ability to care for their loved ones as daughters, as mothers, or as aging adults themselves. So it's a spiral if we don't actually fix this and get past this tension and acknowledge that we have to build a whole new system of care.
So let's take 2 minutes and look at it, Will, through an economist lens, right? Because one of the things that I'm fascinated by is, if you look at all of this analytically and clinically, and globally, what are the jobs that are growing? What are the jobs that are declining? What's the average gender of the jobs that are growing? What's the average age? If ever we had a time to reboot and revalue certain jobs in the global economy, it is now. And so one of the things, I spent a lot of time with economists, labor economists, just talk a little bit, because I feel like we have got to actually engage in revaluing these jobs. And so one worry I have is when we look at this through the lens of gender and people over 50, men and women, and we say who will be the most dislocated by the workforce for the future, which is now, it is women and older men. And so how, as an economist, how do we begin in the roles we all sit in to make the case that you have to value the jobs that need to be done, that have to be filled differently than we have in the past, and break that cycle?
So I'd say one of the most promising trends here is the increasing educational attainment of women. So again, as we take the longer view going through the latter part of the 20th century, women previously had much lower education, and they were getting channeled into different types of jobs that had very different career, salary, income growth potential. Now we're actually seeing that among African American women, we're seeing higher college education, even among those women who are now reaching their 60s. Among whites, we're seeing among the generations in their 50s now, at least, we're seeing higher college attainment among women. And that's going to, I think, naturally push more women into those types of jobs. And what we're seeing is, slowly the workforce is re-equilibrating, where we're seeing more men going into some types of jobs. But I think there's going to have to be a really very strong conversation about norms in the society, that there should not be jobs that are for men, jobs that are for women. And one of the things that I think can help when we talk about the caregiving pieces of this is really encouraging men to embrace the idea that they can and should be taking time off of work for caregiving at equal rates as women. Right? So if earlier in their life they are getting accustomed to the idea that they are caregiving, that they are engaging in these types of jobs, which are so important to society, then later on in life, hopefully they will be more willing to engage in those types of jobs after they retire, a second career as a caregiver, et cetera. So in order for men to embrace this, what we're seeing is some policies now around sort of paid leave. So San Francisco, for example, has a new paid parental leave policy. It's not for all types of caregiving, it's for paid parental leave. And we've been doing an evaluation of this. And what we've seen is that men are actually more likely to be taking more leave as a result of this policy than women. And some people say, well, there we go again, men are capturing the benefits of this paid leave policy. But I think that it's actually very important for helping to normalize the idea that men can and should be taking time off work, engaging in all of these same types of caregiving activities. And that's going to start that sort of longer-term social change process.
But I think one of the things that makes me a little nervous is we're seeing, and it's interesting, we're in DC, which is a very highly educated area, but we still see that, the educational attainment rates for college in particular are not as large as we think they are, and as college is becoming substantially more expensive, populations that are lower income already, what does that mean for their opportunity to actually go and attain that? And when we're thinking about normalizing caregiving, which is not something that we pay a lot of money for, that if you incur $200,000 in debt for college, what is the likelihood you're going to want to go into one of those professions as opposed to something that is going to have a much higher economic return? So I think there's a lot of stuff we need to kind of think about, and sort of how do we not only value caregiving, because I think we think about our teachers and other really important positions that are low paid that have really high implications for what people are doing, but we need to sort of think about that, and we talk a lot about that as well in the medical profession around primary care. Like, how do we incentivize more people to go into primary care?
So do you think, Lisa, if one certain thing I'd observe is that if you really think about, we were trying to create an equal work environment and an equal workforce where people made the choices that were right for them, right? So if I look at in my 40s and 50s, my whole goal was to get women to believe that they had choice and they could make the right choice, right? Now that I'm in my 60s, I have a completely different attitude. I spend a significant amount of my time showing men and women what happens to you when you leave the workforce, right? So I'm no longer passive about that. I'm very clear that here's the economic cost of you leaving. Now let's figure out why you're leaving. And so I'd love to hear, are we doing enough to actually engage in the conversations with women of all races about why they have to stay in the workforce and how we then can help them navigate care? And certainly, want to hear, Debra, your view on that. But I think we can no longer be passive about that conversation. So love to hear everyone's view on that.
Yeah, I think it's a huge issue. And I just wanted to put one, because I'm an economist, and I think valuing caregiving is important. And so we've done a study called Valuing the Invaluable that estimates care, that family caregiving has an economic value of $470 billion. And I think those types of things, as you talk to CEOs and it's really important to put a number on what society is giving up. But back to your question about women, I think particularly older women face a lot more age discrimination than I think we're comfortable talking about. And that is a huge barrier to maintaining a long-term attachment to the labor force. When we asked in 2018 how many people had seen age discrimination from somebody else or from themselves, 2/3 of older people over age 45 had seen it, and 1 in 5 said that they were passed over for a position. And women are much more likely to feel this than men. 64% of women said they either had age discrimination themselves or had seen it in somebody else. And then if we add intersectionality, and I think this is a huge issue, African American women, 77%, 3 out of 4 felt that age discrimination was an issue for them. Hispanic women, 61%, and white women, 59%. And so as we think about longer lives and giving people opportunities and education and keeping them in the workforce, because we have paid caregivers who can take care of their needs at home, we also have to really address this piece too.
I was just going to, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, so we work a lot with employers, and we strongly encourage them to start to have these dialogues with their employees early and help them understand, what they need to be prepared for. One of the things that we work with a lot is helping them explain to their workforce the different financial journey, but also the difference in what's important to women when they want to invest, because part of this is having the right programs to help women make the right choices for them in the workforce, but it's also on the outside helping them make the right decisions to invest so that at the same time they're building their wealth so they can accommodate the lives that they want. There are clearly some similarities between what men and women want from an investment perspective. They care about performance. They care about the peace of mind that successful investing and wealth growth can deliver for them and their financial journey and their families. They're equally confident in many aspects of personal finances. Where they're not equally confident is investing. When we asked women how many of you are confident in investing, about 5 in 10 said they were. When we asked men, it was about 7 in 10. Women like to have everything perfect, have done all the education, all the research before they make a decision. My husband will just, I like the name of that. Let's just go for it. Let's just invest it. So there's a different perspective there. Women also want the money that they invest to provide social good. Mm-hmm. They care about performance, but they also care about the social impact and the causes that are important to them, and that's how they make some of their investment decisions. When we asked the women in our study, over half had said they either plan to invest in investments that have a social impact, or they already had started. One surprising thing while we're talking about investing and women's investment and their financial journey, this was an aha for me in the study that we did on women with financial wellness. We looked at, in March of this year, we looked at the 17 most popular publications for women. And we looked at the pages. There were almost 1,600 pages that we went through. I'm going to give you a second. Just think about how many of those touched upon any aspect of personal finance or money matters. 5. That's less than 1%. So the media, we all in the industries we're in, we need to have these conversations. We need to meet women where they're comfortable and start to educate. Don't make it a taboo subject. And just on ethnicity a little bit with confidence in investing. Financial regret. We asked women what their number one financial regret was in investing. And I'll give you the number one in a minute, but the second largest for African American and Asian women was not beginning their career with a higher paying job. Mm-hmm. For white and Latina women, it was racking up too much credit card debt. That was the second for both of those. The number one financial regret, regardless of ethnicity, was not investing more.
Not investing,
not investing more than what they originally started. So a little bit earlier, a little bit more.
So those are all strategies I think we can start to employ. But one that will and sort of that I want to just unpack a little bit more is this notion about looking at care and looking at all of these issues through an employee's life cycle, right? Or a person's life cycle. Because one of the things I would say, we're very optimistic about is we now, when we look at this notion of lifelong, your role as a lifelong caregiver, we now invite men and women equally, right? So whether it's, you're now starting, this is the first time you're going to experience family leave, we show the journey of you need to become passionate about care, understand the care economy in your 30s and 40s, because you will have to participate in that. So I mean, we keep gravitating back to care, but I do think that when you talk to, you talk to youth and you talk to a lot of people trying to navigate the whole benefits world, they are very concerned about equality of treatment and care for men and women. So let's just talk about that a little, and then we can, get some questions from the audience. But I'm seeing that shift happening more than I'm actually seeing the shift in changing perceptions of ageism. So it's interesting.
Yes.
Much more passion around starting equally on this journey of care. But I think that bodes well for the future, right? If we actually participate in care equally. So.
Yeah. So I'll just build off of a little bit of what Will had started with a bit ago around policies. Like I do think we see both market solutions as well as a public policy that's advancing right now that acknowledge care, and that's what I'm really hopeful about. You know, if you think about last week, I think it was Starbucks' announcement of actually acknowledging the caregiving responsibilities of their employees and offering tremendous benefit, including care navigation, right? Which is a big, let me tell you, I needed care navigation to figure out how to manage all the care needs.
So plus, that's a multi-million-dollar investment that Starbucks is making with Sheila and Care.com.
Exactly.
But they're treating it the same way they treated pay equity. So that to me was very exciting.
Yeah, exactly. So we're seeing more and more employers, as many have spoken on the panel already, to say they're embracing and acknowledging the caregiving responsibilities. On the public policy side, we're really hopeful. Last year, we passed the Kapuna Caregiver Program in Hawaii, which was a financial benefit for working family caregivers to support their additional needs, costs, whether it was having a skilled caregiver in the home, or respite care, or meals, or transportation, because the out-of-pocket expenses for family caregivers are enormous. Similarly, we're seeing a policy push in Washington State called the Long-Term Care Trust Act, which is doing a very similar, creating a financial benefit for family caregivers. And then in addition to that, actually in a couple of weeks in Maine, there's a ballot measure that's underway to make home care accessible to all who are eligible in the state of Maine. And that's really exciting, that it's starting this conversation in families and in communities. Again, these are such privately held issues that people have a hard time acknowledging that we actually need public solutions to what people are really struggling with. So we're excited to see what's possible in Maine. And then I'll say that we've also been exploring at Caring Across Generation a policy concept of universal family care. But this idea of, can we create a social insurance program that everyone pays into, everyone benefits from, that allows people to afford the care that they need, but also infuses money into our care system so that we can, in fact, professionalize and stabilize the care workforce. And the idea is that it would be a portable benefit that workers can take from job to match up with the realities of our changing nature of work today, right? But this is an idea that we're starting to really explore, and in fact, the National Academy of Social Insurance has been doing a research study panel on the administration and financing of such a program. But my point is, we need family care policies more than ever right now. And the demand is there, and I think the opportunity is huge. We have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to invest in policies that will make a difference.
So I agree that the paid family leave is really super exciting, what's going on right now. And we've been interviewing employers around their support for paid family leave. And most employers that we talk to are actually highly supportive.
Yeah.
They're somewhat apprehensive of the cost. But it turns out some of the studies that we've been doing suggest that the cost is actually not all that high in the end, whether it's through sort of social policy that's sort of taxpayer financed or whether it's sort of employer financed. And in addition, we're finding that retention is substantially higher once you have a paid family leave policy. So employers are able to retain their workforce, so it can be a win-win for employers. It's clearly a win for the women and their families. And in the longer term, it keeps women in the workforce, so they're much less likely to have these long gaps in employment, and they come back into the workforce at a lower wage level, which contributes to the long-term gaps.
And just to build on that, part of what we're seeing in the family care, the universal family care work, is it's about paid leave, it's about child care, it's about elder care. It's, to your point, throughout the continuum of care that really matches up with women's experiences, families' experiences around caregiving. It's too fragmented of a system right now, so we need to have more of the connections in place.
And then I think if we can, and maybe you can talk about that, so we can overlay on it the deep understanding of the financial implications of care. So again, rather than these segmented benefits and segmented, really showing through your life cycle, this is actually what care costs, and you need to be planning. I think we've got great education on people planning for saving for retirement, but they don't know how to plan for care.
And more importantly, sometimes your parent gets Alzheimer's, your mother falls and breaks a hip.
Right.
You're not planning in the same way, you've got 9 months before you have a baby. And so a lot of people, again, immediately have to come up with a plan. They often draw down their own savings and own financial resources because it's really expensive to take care of someone. So what excites me about these state laws, in the past we've looked at the person who needs care. And these are really a movement into how do we support the people that are giving the care. And we have a bill that we've been passing now in over 30 states called the CARE Act, which is just to raise the issue of caregiving, and it requires hospitals to take the name of a caregiver when they are admitted into the hospital, call the caregiver when they're going to discharge them, and then give them instructions on all the medical ooey gooey stuff that you have to do when somebody comes out of a hospital. And the conversations we've been having in red states and blue states with governors and state legislators, everybody is experiencing this and struggling with it. And so I'm really excited to see so much movement at this point in which Washington is so gridlocked, to be thinking bigger and how we can support workers, how we can support families, and how we can think broadly across the life course.
And it's interesting, we haven't mentioned the word technology, and I'm conscious of time, but let's just, 2 seconds. I do think technology is going to be an incredible enabler, both in terms of the care economy, but also keeping connected with individuals when they actually have to take time to care. So making sure that we can have them, in an environment where they're going to be able to continue their skill development. They're going to be able, to basically be bidding on work, integrating work into care, not just care into work. And so I think that's a very positive thing we're seeing also. So let me do this. So we'd love to, complex conversation when you look at race and gender through health, financial security, society, but certainly love to hear perspectives here. And then we're going to kind of end with, what are a few things that we're optimistic about that we also think you could do. So perspectives or comments or questions from the group? Please, that's great.
First off, I applaud all of your efforts. It's a great topic. I have a question, maybe Lisa, maybe more towards you, but I have 2 daughters, high school and college, and I find that the financial literacy programs in public education at the elementary even and secondary levels are really lacking. I've been an investor for over 2 decades, and so I understand investments, but they don't know what a mortgage is, they don't know how to budget, they don't know just sort of any kind of instrument as it relates to financial literacy. Mm-hmm. So are there efforts being done from a public policy perspective to get kids when they're young? So as they're growing up, they understand the economic impact of the decisions they're making as it relates to the caregiving or relates to career options, because I feel like if we require it at that age, when you're 13, and you understand what debt is, or you understand what income is, it really would drive a lot of these issues that we're talking about here today later in life to have a better perspective or a better consciousness, if you will, around your decisions that you're making, and you understand the economic impact. Have you seen anything, or are there efforts being done to further that in the public education system? Because I really think it is an educational there's an opportunity here for us to weigh in and really make a difference, not just for little girls, but also little boys,
Right.
like just the whole population.
Absolutely. I can't speak, I'll let others speak to the public side of it, because I'm on the private side, but I will share with you that in a staggering statistic out of our parenting study that we just did, and this is for all parents, men and women, there's a lack of understanding also of early adulthood children. So high expenses for school, for example. People are coming back living with their parents, requiring their parents fund, some of their expenses. Collectively, in this country, parents spend $500 billion supporting their young adult children because of these things that have accumulated over the years. That is twice the amount that they contribute to their retirement plans. Staggering. What I would say for the younger, what we did in this study is we took a look at some suggestions on how to help the education of the younger children at every age. And what we're doing is we're sharing that with the employer clients that we have, and we are encouraging them to go out into their workforce. So we have hundreds of employers we work with. If they can get to their employees, they can take it home. It's how to educate children at every stage. So, you take 5 stages up until they become ready for college. What's the important education? We have online tools. We have a great retail site, Better Money Habits, that actually has a section for how to talk to your children about money. And you need to it's not just the educating, you have to take action. When it's time to set up an account, I did with my kids when they turned 16, my son and my daughter, we didn't just talk about savings. I took them to the bank and they opened up a savings account. And when it becomes personal for them, they learn a little bit quicker, right?
So
personal,
great
so
question.
education, action. So there's education online, and we're trying to get at it that way. We have 15,000 advisors across the country. We encourage them to meet with families. So if you have a personal advisor, or if you work with advisors, encourage them to meet not only with you, but you and your family. And sometimes it takes that mediator who can have some of those uncomfortable conversations with their children as they get older about savings. And hey, at your table at dinner tonight, ask your children, how much do you think it costs for me to send you to college? And see what they say. And just start.
We don't want to go there, right?
Just start having the dialogue a little bit at a time.
So I'm really conscious of our time, and we're supposed to always end on a action-oriented set of themes. So, let's start, well, in your world, I mean, we're optimistic about a number of things, but also, as you think about, one thing we can do to actually continue the momentum, what would you recommend? Or what do you say?
So in addition to the policy initiatives that we just talked about, I would just go back to my theme about changing norms. And I would challenge every single male here to think very deeply about their own family situation and what are the opportunities for having those frank discussions about who should be the caregiver in each of those opportunities in your life, in your world, in your extended family, and your friends, and challenge your employers to be thinking about what your employer can be doing to help support this.
That's great. Debra, what do you see?
If I had a dream, I would end racial, gender, and age discrimination, and that would solve a lot. But I think more practically, I'm not saying I'm less worried about gender discrimination, because I am, but it's the socioeconomic disparities, and I think that are really, really inherent in this country. And that have bigger differentials. And those are social determinants of health, good jobs, making sure that that pay is equalized across all racial sectors and areas. So I guess I'm back to end racism, gender discrimination, and ageism. But
In our lifetime.
I've got 2 kids. I would really like to see that happen.
That's great. That's great. Kara?
So I agree with that. I think one of the things I'm excited about is so many more people are talking about the social determinants of health. It's no longer an eye-rolling thing that people say in conversation, and so helping us to understand the relationship between housing, food, income, education, all of these pieces on our health outcomes. I think if we can continue that progress, that we can develop more comprehensive solutions that will help get people to be able to have that opportunity. And one of the things that, just remembering that your experience is kind of based on where you sit. And the experiences are very different for different people, and trying to walk a little bit in those shoes, because I think that one of the things that we can all sort of think about, even when you're having that initial conversation about saving, if you're living paycheck to paycheck, how do you squeeze out even $5 to start saving? So I think the more that we can develop tools to help people, sort of no matter what your income is, there's a little bit you can do. We might have fewer people who have that regret when they age about not investing sooner.
Sarita?
As I mentioned before, I think just supporting some of the state efforts that are underway right now are really important. And just to build on the culture component, I think, again, part of shifting norms is all of us talking about these issues of care and caregiving, and the intersectionality with all these issues that Kara just laid out, and what Deb was getting at in terms of the socioeconomic determinants of all these outcomes. But I think it's really important to start personal, like having the conversations in your families, in your communities, to break out of these issues being so personally held, so we can, in fact, be really innovative on the solutions we need for the greater good.
Dialogue.
And I would say I would love to see us to continue to strive at breaking the taboo around women and their personal finances. And I would encourage everyone in this, every single one of you, if you're uncomfortable having those conversations, seek a mentor. If you're comfortable having those conversations, be a mentor.
I think it's a great summary. And a couple of things I would just say, we spend a lot talking about policy, benefits, a lot of the data, but I think we don't spend enough time talking about culture and communication. So I think each one of us can talk about in our teams. I lead a very big global team. What's my struggle? When did my husband and I make the decision that he would actually step out and do something different? What was it like when my mother was dying? What were my issues with care? Interestingly, we don't talk enough about the experience that we all have, and then make it safe certainly within the corporate world, to actually convene around those topics. And I think each one of us could leave here and do that. So, so thank you. Thank you for your attention and time, and go off and do something. So it's good. Thank you. Thank you.